Welcome to our latest explainer. Today, we're diving into one of the most fascinating and, frankly, tragic paradoxes in modern history. Yeah, absolutely. We're breaking down the massive disconnect between the lofty imperial dreams that kicked off the First World War and the brutal economic math that ultimately finished it.
We've got a lot of ground to cover, so here's the game plan. We'll start with the web of alliances, look at battleships and imperial ambitions, and then examine the incredibly rigid military plans. After that, we'll shift to changing aims and new players, dive into the economics of total war, and wrap up with the staggering cost of the conflict.
All right, part one, the web of alliances. Let's map out exactly who was fighting whom when Europe plunged into chaos in August of 1914.
The major players essentially fell into two massive blocks. On one side, you've got the Central Powers. This was led by a rapidly industrializing Germany alongside an internally fractured Austria-Hungary, with the Ottoman Empire and Bulgaria jumping in a bit later.
Right, and squaring off against them are the Allied powers, anchored by the heavy-hitting trio of France, Russia, and Britain.
Now, even though nobody published a master list of war aims before the armistice, each nation had very specific, often non-negotiable goals right out of the gate. Take France. They were desperate for security and practically laser-focused on reclaiming Alsace-Lorraine, which they lost back in 1871. And then you have Britain entering the fray explicitly to defend Belgian neutrality. Austria-Hungary, on the other hand, felt that crushing Serbia was the only way to stop the nationalist unrest that was threatening to tear their whole empire apart. Exactly. And the Ottoman Empire? They were just fighting to survive, trying to avoid being partitioned by the great powers and keeping their independence intact.
Moving on to part two, battleships and imperial ambitions. Because long before a single shot was fired on land, there was this massive psychological arms race playing out on the high seas.
This whole maritime buildup was totally driven by Germany's Weltpolitik, their strategy to become a dominant global empire. It really kicked off with the Navy bills of 1898 under Admiral von Tirpitz, as Germany set out to build a fleet that could legitimately challenge the British Royal Navy.
Fast forward to 1906, and both of these nations are locked in a frantic, no-holds-barred race to construct these massive dreadnought-class battleships. It bred so much intense mutual suspicion that when they finally tried to hold arms control talks in 1912, the negotiations just completely fell apart.
What's wild about this famous naval race is that it was mathematically decided pretty early on. Britain basically won just by outspending Germany. By the time the war started, Britain had 45 dreadnought-class ships either in service or being built, compared to Germany's 26. Just to put that into perspective, a single dreadnought cost roughly £2.5 million back then. We're talking about an astronomical fortune. But even when clear-headed observers realized the race was already over, the hostility and paranoia it generated had totally paved the way for war.
Meanwhile, over on land, Germany's ambitions were just as massive. Their goal was to create this dominant Middle Europe, a pan-continental economic bloc firmly under German control.
The logic driving this is really fascinating. The prevailing thought was that the 20th century was going to be dominated by huge land empires, specifically the US, Britain, and Russia. So, to compete on a global scale and avoid being completely eclipsed, Germany felt they absolutely needed a massive economic bloc of their own.
That brings us to part three, rigid plans and strategies. Let's see how those massive political ambitions translated into some fatally inflexible military planning.
Looking at historical analyses from scholars like Paul Kennedy, the operational planning of this era perfectly captured the political assumptions of the establishment. And the real tragedy is that the diplomats were basically forced to serve the military's strict, uncompromising timetables, rather than the other way around. The tail was completely wagging the dog.
This analysis of Germany's famous Schlieffen Plan just brilliantly shows the trap they built for themselves. The strategy was so utterly rigid that merely seeing Russia mobilize was enough to trigger a preemptive German invasion of France, rolling right through neutral Belgium.
It's crazy to think about. Military timetables entirely overrode any diplomatic off-ramps. Mobilization literally meant war, with zero room for negotiation.
Next up, part four, changing aims and new players. As the war dragged on for years and all those initial rapid strike strategies failed, the belligerents desperately searched for ways to break the bloody deadlock. A major turning point, of course, was the American entry into the conflict in April 1917. But here's a question for you. Why did President Woodrow Wilson flat out refuse to formally join the Allied alliance? Well, Wilson insisted that the U.S. fight strictly as an associated power.
He completely refused to tie American economic and military might to the Allied cause, if a victory just meant going back to status quo great power politics and old-school territorial grabs.
Right, he was playing the long game. He wanted the diplomatic leverage to push his own 14 points, which envisioned a brand new international system based on democracy, self-determination, and free trade.
Moving into Part 5, the economics of total war. Let's shift our focus from the battlefield straight to the balance sheet. Because at the end of the day, this conflict became a brutal math equation. Looking at the pre-war GDP data from 1913, the true balance of power is actually incredibly obvious. The United States had a massive economic advantage at $517 billion, and the UK was sitting at $226 billion.
And then you compare that to the Central Powers. Germany was at $244 billion, but Austria-Hungary was lagging way behind at just $100.5 billion.
The big takeaway here is that a country's level of economic development directly dictated its ability to mobilize for total war. We hear so many stories about troop morale or brilliant generals, but the hard data shows that richer nations were simply more capable of absorbing the shock of massive resource allocation.
Exactly. Industrialized war is unbelievably expensive, and poor countries collapse under that crushing weight much faster than wealthy ones do.
And that grim economic reality really dictated the final outcome. Germany and Austria's economies flatlined below pre-war levels almost immediately, but the Allies were definitely feeling the burn too.
Yeah, by 1916, 1917, Russia and France were facing severe economic collapse themselves. So that massive influx of American economic power wasn't just helpful, it was the definitive tiebreaker that kept the Allied war machine running.
Finally, Part 6, the staggering cost of conflict. We've talked about the grand illusions, but now we really need to confront the unprecedented ruin left in their wake.
After the dust settled, economist Ernest Bogart calculated the net direct cost of the conflict at an absolutely staggering $186 billion. That's just the money spent directly on the physical mechanics of destroying the enemy.
And get this, that number doesn't even touch the indirect costs, which came in at over $151 billion. It's a completely sobering figure. That covers massive property losses on land, thousands of ships and cargoes sitting at the bottom of the ocean, and, chillingly, the capitalized economic value of the millions of human lives extinguished, both on the battlefield and at home.
When you add all of that together, the grand total bill for the First World War comes to nearly $338 billion. It was a horrifying, unprecedented destruction of capital. It permanently stunted European economic growth and completely altered the trajectory of the global economy for decades to come.
We've seen how diplomatic inflexibility, naval paranoia, and grand ideas of empire literally drag the world into an industrial meat grinder.
So we want to leave you with this final haunting question to ponder. When you look at the devastating math, was the stubborn pursuit of those pre-war imperial illusions worth the absolute economic and human ruin they ultimately purchased? Thanks for exploring this complex slice of history with us on this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and we'll catch you next time.